Black doctor saves racist critic's child. The act changes his views forever. No, please, my daughter, she can't breathe. Richard Peterson's voice cracked with desperation as he cradled 8-year-old Emily in his arms. Her lips had turned a terrifying shade of blue, her small chest heaving with increasingly shallow breaths. The hospital waiting room buzzed with activity, but to Richard, everything moved in slow motion. "Someone help us! She's dying!" he screamed, his face contorted with fear. Dr. Marcus Johnson rushed forward, his white coat billowing behind him. Without hesitation, he took Emily from Richard's arms. "Anaphylactic shock," Dr. Johnson announced, his voice calm but urgent. "Get me epinephrine now." Richard stumbled backward, watching helplessly as the doctor he'd spent months publicly criticizing laid his daughter on a gurney. The same doctor whose appointment as chief of emergency medicine he'd protested with vicious letters to the hospital board and inflammatory editorials in the local newspaper. "Sir, I need to know if she has any allergies," Dr. Johnson demanded, already checking Emily's airways. Richard stood frozen, shame and fear battling within him as he looked into the determined eyes of the man he'd called unqualified and dangerous just last week at the town hall meeting. "Peanuts," Richard finally managed. "She's allergic to peanuts," Dr. Johnson nodded, injecting the life-saving medication into Emily's thigh. The next few moments would determine everything, but let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when the Peterson family was enjoying a perfect summer afternoon. Richard Peterson adjusted his aviator sunglasses as he watched his daughter Emily run through the sprinkler in their meticulously maintained backyard. His wife, Corinne, sat beside him on the patio, flipping through the latest issue of Good Housekeeping. "Don't get too wet, honey. We need to leave for the festival in 30 minutes, Corinne called out. It was Independence Day in Millfield, a small town where everyone knew everyone and traditions ran deep. The annual community festival was the highlight of the summer, complete with a parade, pie contest, and fireworks display. Richard sipped his lemonade contentedly. At 58, he had built exactly the life he had always wanted. A successful insurance business that his father had started in 1965, a beautiful colonial home in the good part of town, and a reputation as someone who spoke his mind and protected the town's traditional values. "Did you see the newspaper this morning?" Richard asked his wife. "They're letting that Johnson fellow speak at the festival. Can you believe it?" Corinne glanced up from her magazine. "The new doctor." "What's wrong with that?" Richard scoffed. "What's wrong? He's been here 6 months and they're already making him chief of emergency medicine, over doctors who have served this town for decades, and now he's giving some speech about modernizing healthcare access or whatever they're calling it." "Well, I heard Mrs. Abernathy say he saved her Harold after that heart attack," Corinne replied mildly. "Said he was brilliant." Richard waved his hand dismissively. "That's not the point, Corinne. It's about qualifications and paying your dues. This town has a way of doing things. You don't just walk in and take over." What Richard didn't say, what he rarely said out loud, was that Dr. Marcus Johnson didn't look like the doctors who had treated the Peterson family for generations. The prestigious position of chief of emergency medicine had never been held by a black man in Millfield Memorial Hospital's 70-year history. "Daddy, look what I found." Emily ran up to the patio, her blonde hair dripping wet, clutching something in her small palm. Richard's stern expression softened immediately. 8-year-old Emily was the unexpected blessing of his later years, born long after her older siblings had left for college. He doted on her completely. "What have you got there, princess?" Emily opened her hand to reveal a small, iridescent blue butterfly. "It was on the roses, isn't it pretty?" "Beautiful," Richard agreed. "Just like you." "Now go get dressed for the festival. We leave in 20 minutes. As Emily skipped into the house, Corinne gave her husband a meaningful look. "You know, Richard, you might actually like Dr. Johnson if you gave him a chance. Claire from my book club says he's very good with her kids." Richard folded his newspaper with a sharp snap. "I don't need to meet him to know he's not right for this town. Some things just work better when they stay the way they've always been." Corinne sighed and gathered her magazine. After 35 years of marriage, she knew when an argument wasn't worth pursuing. The Millfield Independence Day Festival transformed the town square into a vibrant celebration of Americana. Red, white, and blue bunting hung from every lamppost, and the smell of barbecue and cotton candy filled the air. A band played hits from the 1970s on the main stage, the sounds of Fleetwood Mac and the Eagles creating a nostalgic backdrop. Richard nodded approvingly as they passed the Veterans Memorial display, where men his age and older stood proudly in their military caps. He'd been too young for Vietnam, but his father had served in Korea, and Richard made a point of supporting veteran causes. Look, Daddy, cotton candy. Emily tugged at his hand, pointing toward a vendor with a pink fluffy cloud on a paper cone. Sure thing, sweetie. Karen will meet you by the pavilion for the speeches. Karen nodded, already greeting a friend from her garden club. Don't let her spoil her dinner. And remember, we're meeting Susan and Bill at the picnic area at 5. Richard led Emily through the crowd, greeting neighbors and clients with practiced small-town charm. He was well known in Millfield, served on the Chamber of Commerce, the hospital board, and wrote a monthly opinion column for the Millfield Gazette called Traditional Values. Well, if it isn't the voice of Millfield himself, came a friendly voice. Richard turned to see Bill Harrington, his oldest friend and fishing buddy. They'd known each other since elementary school in the 1960s, back when Millfield was even smaller and more homogeneous than it was now. Bill, thought we were meeting you later. Bill clapped him on the shoulder. Just setting up our spot. Susan's guarding the picnic table. He bent down to Emily's level. And how's my favorite junior fishing champion? Emily grinned, revealing a missing front tooth. Caught a butterfly today? Did you now? Well, that's even harder than catching those trout we got last weekend. Bill straightened up, lowering his voice. Say, Rich, you giving Johnson a hard time today? I saw your letter in the paper yesterday. Richard's expression darkened. Someone's got to say something. This town is changing too fast. Bill nodded in agreement. My dad would roll over in his grave if he knew who was running things these days. A small commotion near the central pavilion caught their attention. People were gathering for the ceremonial speeches that traditionally opened the festival. Looks like they're starting, Richard said. Let's get Emily that cotton candy and find Karen. The pavilion was packed with townsfolk sitting on folding chairs or standing around the perimeter. Mayor Wilson, a balding man with an expansive waistline who had held office for 3 consecutive terms, approached the microphone. Welcome, friends and neighbors, to Millfield's 76th Annual Independence Day Festival. Polite applause rippled through the crowd as the mayor launched into his usual speech about small-town values and community spirit. Richard stood at the back, Emily perched on his shoulders for a better view, her hands sticky with cotton candy. Karen found them and gave Richard a pointed look at the sugary treat, but said nothing. And now, Mayor Wilson continued, I'd like to introduce someone who's already making a difference in our community. Our new chief of emergency medicine at Millfield Memorial, Dr. Marcus Johnson. Richard tensed as a tall, well-dressed black man in his early 40s approached the microphone. Dr. Johnson had a commanding presence, confident but not arrogant, with a warm smile that immediately engaged the audience. Thank you, Mayor Wilson, and thank you, Millfield, for the warm welcome my family and I have received these past 6 months. His voice was deep and resonant, with the polished delivery of someone used to public speaking. Richard frowned, having expected, perhaps wanted, to find him less articulate, less impressive. Healthcare is changing across America, and small towns like ours face unique challenges, Dr. Johnson continued. I'm committed to bringing the highest standard of emergency care to every person who walks through our hospital doors, regardless of who they are or where they come from. A round of applause followed this statement. Richard did not join in. Before I came to Millfield, I worked in one of Chicago's busiest trauma centers. I've treated gunshot wounds, car accidents, heart attacks, and everything in between. But what brought me here was the opportunity to know my patients as neighbors, not just medical cases. Dr. Johnson's gaze swept across the crowd, and for a brief moment, Richard felt the doctor's eyes land on him. Had Johnson recognized him as the author of those critical letters? In the coming months, we'll be expanding our emergency services, reducing wait times, and introducing new outreach programs for seniors and underserved communities. My door is always open to hear your concerns and suggestions. More applause, louder this time. Richard shifted uncomfortably. One last thing, Dr. Johnson added with a smile. My wife Janet has entered her famous peach cobbler in the pie contest, so if you want to welcome us properly, make sure to vote for entry number 17. This drew appreciative laughter from the crowd. As Dr. Johnson stepped away from the microphone, people moved forward to shake his hand or introduce themselves. He seems nice, Karen commented. Richard grunted noncommittally. Speeches are easy. Running an emergency room is different. Emily squirmed on his shoulders. Daddy, I'm hungry. Can we go find Aunt Susan and Uncle Bill? Good idea, Princess. Richard lifted her down. Let's get some real food in you after all that sugar. As they made their way to the picnic area, Richard couldn't help but notice how many people were gathered around Dr. Johnson, how easily he laughed and connected with them. It bothered him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. The picnic area was arranged with long tables covered in red and white checkered cloths. Bill and Susan had claimed a prime spot near the barbecue pits where volunteers were grilling burgers and hot dogs. There they are, Susan waved them over. At 56, Susan still maintained the cheerleader enthusiasm of her high school days when she and Karen had been best friends. Sorry we're late, Karen said, setting down her tote bag. The speeches ran long. We heard the new doctor, Richard added, his tone making clear what he thought of that. Bill handed him a paper plate. Well, you're just in time for food. They've got Mrs. Henderson's famous potato salad this year. Emily tugged at her mother's sleeve. Can I get a hot dog? I'll take her, Susan offered. I want to check out the pie contest entries anyway. Janet Johnson's peach cobbler has some serious competition from my blueberry crumble. As Susan led Emily toward the food line, Bill leaned in. So what did you think of Dr. Diversity's speech? Richard snorted. All talk. You know these academic types, big on fancy words, short on real-world experience. Millfield Memorial was doing just fine before he showed up, Bill agreed. Dr. Harrison ran that ER for 20 years without any complaints, Karen interjected, except for the time he misdiagnosed Mr. Patterson's appendicitis and sent him home with antacids. Both men looked at her in surprise. What? She said defensively. I'm just saying maybe some new blood isn't such a bad thing. Richard was about to respond when a commotion from the food line caught their attention. A child was crying no, screaming, and it sounded like, Emily! Richard was on his feet instantly, searching frantically for his daughter. He spotted Susan waving desperately from the hot dog stand, and he ran, pushing through the crowd with Karen close behind. Emily was on the ground, her face alarmingly red and swollen, gasping for breath. Susan knelt beside her, panic written across her face. I don't know what happened, Susan cried. She took one bite of her hot dog and just collapsed. Richard dropped to his knees beside his daughter. Emily, Emily, baby, what's wrong? Emily couldn't speak. Her lips were swelling, her breathing coming in frightening wheezes. Karen screamed for help. Someone call an ambulance. People gathered around, their faces blurring in Richard's panicked vision. Everything was happening too fast. Then a commanding voice cut through the chaos. Let me through, I'm a doctor. The crowd parted and Dr. Marcus Johnson knelt beside Emily, his trained eyes quickly assessing the situation. She's having an allergic reaction. Does she have any known allergies? He asked sharply. Richard's mind went blank with fear. Karen answered, peanuts. She's severely allergic to peanuts. Dr. Johnson looked toward the hot dog. Was there any peanut oil or peanut butter near the food? The vendor stepped forward nervously. We fry our onions in peanut oil. She needs epinephrine now, Dr. Johnson declared. Does she have an EpiPen? Karen's hands flew to her mouth. It's in my other purse at home, I didn't think. Without hesitation, Dr. Johnson called to someone in the crowd. Janet, get my emergency kit from the car now. A woman nodded and ran off, returning moments later with a black medical bag. Dr. Johnson pulled out a syringe and a small vial. I always carry emergency medications, he explained, drawing up the correct dose with practiced efficiency. This is epinephrine. It will counteract the allergic reaction. Richard watched, helpless and terrified, as Dr. Johnson injected the medication into Emily's thigh. For a few agonizing seconds, nothing seemed to change. Then Emily drew a slightly deeper breath than another. It's working, Dr. Johnson confirmed, monitoring her pulse. But she needs to get to the hospital immediately. The epinephrine is temporary. As if on cue, sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Ambulance is 2 minutes out, someone reported. Dr. Johnson looked directly at Richard. I'll ride with her to the hospital. We need to monitor her breathing continuously. Richard nodded numbly, unable to form words. The doctor who had been the target of his public criticism for months was now fighting to save his daughter's life. The ambulance ride was a blur of activity and fear. Dr. Johnson worked alongside the paramedics, keeping a constant eye on Emily's vital signs. Richard and Karen held each other's hands so tightly their knuckles turned white, watching their little girl fight for every breath. Her airways are still compromised, Dr. Johnson told the paramedic. Let's start a second line and get more fluids going. Richard couldn't take his eyes off the doctor's hands, steady, confident, gentle as they worked on Emily. The same hands he had implied in his newspaper column weren't qualified enough to lead Millfield's emergency department. Almost there, the paramedic announced as the ambulance swerved through traffic. Dr. Johnson leaned closer to Emily. You're doing great, sweetheart. Just keep breathing. We're going to take good care of you. The tenderness in his voice made Richard's throat tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. The ambulance bay doors at Millfield Memorial Hospital burst open as they arrived. Dr. Johnson was already calling out orders. Severe anaphylaxis in an 8-year-old female, administered 0, 15 mg epinephrine at seen approximately 12 minutes ago needs a second dose immediately. A team of nurses and doctors swarmed around Emily's stretcher, transferring her to a hospital bed with practiced efficiency. Karen clutched Richard's arm as they hurried alongside, trying to stay close to their daughter. "BP's dropping again," a nurse called out. "Start a second dose of epi and add diphenhydramine," Dr. Johnson ordered, "and get me a pediatric intubation tray just in case." The words sent a chill through Richard. Intubation, a breathing tube, was Emily getting worse? "Mr. and Mrs. Peterson," a gentle voice interrupted his thoughts. A nurse guided them to the side of the trauma bay. "I need to get some information from you while Dr. Johnson works." Karen stepped forward automatically, answering questions about Emily's medical history, previous allergic reactions, and medications. Richard remained frozen, his eyes fixed on Dr. Johnson's back as the doctor leaned over Emily, listening to her chest with a stethoscope. Time stretched like taffy, minutes feeling like hours. The hospital's emergency department bustled around them, other patients and families caught in their own medical dramas, but for Richard, the world had narrowed to his daughter's hospital bed and the man working to save her. Finally, Dr. Johnson approached them, removing his gloves. "She's stabilizing," he said, and Richard felt his knees go weak with relief. "We've got the allergic reaction under control, but I want to keep her overnight for observation. Sometimes there can be a secondary reaction hours later." "Can we see her?" Karen asked, her voice trembling. "Of course. They're moving her to a room now. I'll take you there myself." As they walked through the hospital corridors, Richard struggled to find words. What do you say to a man you've publicly denounced who is now your child's savior? Dr. Johnson led them to a small, private room where Emily lay in a bed that seemed too large for her small frame. An IV dripped medication into her arm and a monitor beeped steadily with her heart rate. Her face was still puffy, but the terrifying blue tinge to her lips was gone. "Mommy, Daddy," Emily's voice was hoarse but recognizable. Karen rushed to her side, stroking her hair. "We're here, baby. You're going to be okay." Richard stood at the foot of the bed, emotions churning inside him. Relief, gratitude, and an uncomfortable awareness of his own prejudice collided in his chest. Dr. Johnson checked Emily's vital signs once more. "Everything looks good. The nurse will be checking on her regularly through the night." He turned to leave, then paused. "Mr. Peterson, could I speak with you outside for a moment?" Richard followed the doctor into the hallway, bracing himself. Would Johnson mention the letters, the editorials, the public opposition? He deserved whatever was coming. Instead, Dr. Johnson's face showed only professional concern. "Emily's allergy seems quite severe." "Has she been seen by an allergist recently?" The question was so unexpected that Richard took a moment to respond. Yes, about a year ago. I'd like to consult with her allergist and perhaps adjust her emergency protocol, and I strongly recommend carrying multiple EpiPens, one for home, one for school, one for outings." Richard nodded, shame burning in his chest. "Of course, whatever you think is best." Dr. Johnson studied him for a moment. "I know this has been frightening. But Emily is going to be fine. She's a strong little girl." "Thank you," Richard finally managed, the words wholly inadequate. "For everything. At the festival you were if you hadn't been there." He couldn't finish the thought, the alternative too terrible to voice. Dr. Johnson placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I'm glad I was there. That's all that matters." The simple statement hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken meaning. As Dr. Johnson walked away to attend to other patients, Richard watched him go, seeing for the first time not an outsider threatening tradition, but a skilled physician who had just saved the most precious thing in his world. "Dr. Marcus says I can help give tour of the clinic. Can I?" Richard smiled at his daughter, grateful beyond words that she was healthy and thriving, and that her world would be broader and more inclusive than the one he had grown up in. "Of course you can, Princess. Lead the way." Now back to where we started. "No, please, my daughter, she can't breathe." Richard Peterson's voice cracked with desperation as he cradled 8-year-old Emily in his arms. Her lips had turned a terrifying shade of blue, her small chest heaving with increasingly shallow breaths. The hospital waiting room buzzed with activity, but to Richard, everything moved in slow motion. "Someone help us! She's dying!" he screamed, his face contorted with fear. Dr. Marcus Johnson rushed forward, his white coat billowing behind him. Without hesitation, he took Emily from Richard's arms. "Anaphylactic shock," Dr. Johnson announced, his voice calm but urgent. "Get me epinephrine now." Richard stumbled backward, watching helplessly as the doctor he'd spent months publicly criticizing laid his daughter on a gurney. The same doctor whose appointment as chief of emergency medicine he'd protested with vicious letters to the hospital board and inflammatory editorials in the local newspaper. "Sir, I need to know if she has any allergies," Dr. Johnson demanded, already checking Emily's airways. Richard stood frozen, shame and fear battling within him as he looked into the determined eyes of the man he'd called unqualified and dangerous just last week at the town hall meeting. "Peanuts," Richard finally managed. "She's allergic to peanuts." Dr. Johnson nodded, injecting the life-saving medication into Emily's thigh. The next few moments would determine everything. But this wasn't the emergency room at Millfield Memorial. This was the newly opened community health clinic, where Richard and Marcus were giving a tour to potential donors when a young Hispanic boy had rushed in, struggling to breathe another case of anaphylaxis, another child in danger. And as Richard watched Marcus work to save this boy with the same skill and compassion he had shown Emily 6 months ago, he understood with perfect clarity that this moment, this clinic, this transformed community was why they had fought so hard. So that every child, regardless of who they were or where they came from, could receive the care they deserved when they needed it most. The boy's breathing eased as the medication took effect. His terrified parents wept with relief, clinging to each other just as Richard and Karen had done. One of the potential donors, an elderly woman who had initially expressed skepticism about the need for the clinic, turned to Richard with wide eyes. "I had no idea," she whispered. "If this clinic hadn't been here." Richard nodded, the unspoken conclusion hanging in the air between them. Without the clinic, without Marcus, another family might have experienced an unimaginable loss today. Later, as the emergency subsided and the tour resumed, Marcus fell into step beside Richard in a quiet moment. "You okay?" he asked. "That must have brought back difficult memories." Richard looked at his friend, the man who had saved his daughter, challenged his worldview, and helped him become a better version of himself. "Actually," Richard replied, "it reminded me of how far we've come and how much further we still have to go." Marcus smiled, understanding in his eyes. "Well then, partner, let's keep going." And they did, side by side, two men from different worlds united by a shared vision of what their community could become, more compassionate, more inclusive, more just. Not by erasing the past or denying their differences, but by acknowledging them, learning from them, and growing beyond them together. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.